So good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Shireen Ash. I'm a librarian at the Corte Madera Library, and I'm happy to welcome Shannon Burke, who is an interpretive naturalist at the Marin County Parks, to give yet another wonderful talk. As many of you know, Shannon's a wonderful speaker, very knowledgeable about the local flora and fauna. So she'll be sharing information today about urban wildlife in Marin. So we'll find out a lot of information, I know. So please stay muted during the presentation. At the end of Shannon's talk, please, if you have any questions, you can put your questions in the chat, actually at the end or throughout. I will read them out and Shannon will answer them. So with that, I will turn the program over to you, Shannon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Shireen. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. And I just want to thank Shireen for helping to coordinate this. It's always fun and super easy to work with Shireen on doing these lectures. So I really appreciate it. So I am the interpretive naturalist for Marin County Parks, and I lead a lot of public walks. I typically do 1 or 2 a week. They're always free, go to different places around the county and talk about different things, whatever's going on seasonally. And then we also have ranger programming and volunteer opportunities as well. So if you want more information, check out marincountyparks.org. So today we're going to talk about urban wildlife. And, you know, here in Marin, we have so much open space. We have so many preserved areas. And then we have neighborhoods that are kind of adjacent to those. So we end up with a lot of interface between urban and wild areas. And that means that if you're hanging out in your neighborhoods, a lot of times you get to enjoy wildlife. So today we're going to look at some of the species that are kind of common visitors in or around our neighborhoods and learn a little bit about them. And so this is kind of just going to be a brief overview with some fun stuff about some of these different species. So one of the most common neighborhood visitors are deer. And so the species that we have here are called black-tailed deer. And if you look at this photo, you get this nice back view. So they've got this white rump and then a black tail. On the East Coast, the eastern part of the country, North America, you get white-tailed deer. But here on the West Coast, if you look at the map on the left-hand side, that is the range map for mule deer. And so they are western species. And then there are 2 subspecies. Well, there's a subspecies, which is the black-tailed deer. And there are 2 different forms of that. And so the Sitka is up from kind of British Columbia up into Alaska. And then our version, our flavor of deer, is the Colombian black-tailed deer. So you can see this dark purple along the coast. So they've got that white rump and a black tail, but when they are threatened and they are trying to get away from a potential predator, they raise their tail, and that exposes the white sort of flag at the back, right? And so this serves 2 purposes. One, it alarms or kind of alerts the other deer in the area, if there are other deer. And then also if you have a group of deer that start running, it helps to keep them together. So they have that sort of visual signal that they can watch so that they're all running in the same direction and one doesn't, you know, suddenly turn right when the rest are going left, which would make them more vulnerable to a pursuing predator. The other thing is, when a predator sees that, it's a signal that they have been spotted. And so it kind of in a way is telling the predator, hey, we already see you, don't bother chasing us. You know, we're on alert and we're going to get away. So the males have antlers for part of the year. Antlers are these just amazing structures. They're made out of bone. They grow directly from the skull. So if you find a deer skull, and if it's males, you can see these sort of rings on the top, and that's where the antlers have been formed. And so it's made of bone, and it is the fastest growing tissue in the animal kingdom. It grows incredibly fast. And as they're growing, they're covered in velvet. So it's covered in skin with a sort of soft fur on it. And so it's referred to as velvet. And the purpose of that is to supply blood to the bone as that bone is growing. And then once the antlers are fully formed, they start to harden off. And so they start to get hard and dense, and they are no longer growing. And at that point, the velvet kind of sloughs off. And so you can see deer walking around, and their antlers just look messy, and sometimes they even look a little bit bloody, but there's nothing wrong with that. It's natural. It's just part of the process. And then eventually they will drop their antlers. And some people like to collect antlers, take them home, put them on their mantle or whatever. But it's good to keep in mind that that's actually a source of calcium. So a lot of different animals will end up chewing on those and getting calcium and different nutrients. So it's good to leave them in the environment. And they tend to lose the antlers in the winter when it's a good source of those nutrients for animals when there aren't a lot of other things to eat. So the purpose for the antlers is for males to sort of show their strength and their dominance during the rut. And so the rut is a synchronized period of breeding in deer. And so it happens in the fall, but in any given area, it typically only happens for about 1 or 2 weeks. And then within that period of time, each individual female is only able to conceive in a 24 to 36 hour window. And so you end up with all of the females coming into breeding condition in, very, very similar time. And so the males are vying for dominance to be able to breed with them. And so they will sometimes spar, and the antlers are designed to reduce actual injury. So they will lock their antlers, but they do this very slowly. It's not like they're running toward each other and bashing into each other. They kind of lower their antlers, they engage, they rock back and forth. And sometimes it can, they're strong animals with strong necks, and so it can get pretty heated. But they definitely use them for sparring instruments rather than spearing instruments, right? And then also they will take their antlers and rack bushes with them back and forth, make a bunch of noise. And this is a dominance display that is intended to chase off, or scare off potentially younger deer or deer that aren't as strong. And then after the rut happens in the fall, the antlers are lost in the winter time, and the hormones all calm down at that point. And then in the springtime, late spring into summer, is when the fawns are born. And females typically give birth to twins. And in their first week, they actually don't have any scent. And so the mother who has just given birth needs to replenish her strength. She also needs to eat a lot of food in order to be nursing, usually these two young. And so she goes off and she forages. And if she were to have the really young fawns with her, they would be vulnerable to predation, right? They're just not quite big enough, not quite strong enough. So she actually ends up leaving them, typically separately, in a safe spot. And the fawns know to just curl up and be quiet and stay put. And then eventually the mother comes back for them. And so you can find deer like this adorable little one curled up. And some people think that they've been abandoned, but the mother will come back. If you find one that obviously is in distress and it's bleeding and it's bleating, not bleeding, and wandering around, then you can call wild care. But if it's just curled up like this, even if it's standing or walking around, but it doesn't seem distressed, it's perfectly fine. Mom will come back in a few hours, so don't worry about it. But a lot of times they are left in neighborhoods, like in yards. And this can be a pretty protected spot from predators in our neighborhoods, right? And so a lot of times you find them in your yard. Oh, and I mentioned that they are scentless. They don't have a scent for the first week. And so that's also to evade predators. So predators can't really sniff them out and find them. So if you find a fawn in your yard, just leave it be. But a lot of animals are attracted to our yards. And so raccoons are a really common visitor, and they can take advantage of getting underneath sheds or in crawl spaces, things like that. We as humans have a lot of structures, and those structures can provide safe, quiet, dark spaces where they can rest and be safe. Raccoons are predominantly nocturnal, so usually they're out foraging at night, but it's not unusual to see one foraging during the day, especially when the mother is nursing. She has to be finding a lot of food. And so if you see a raccoon out and about in the daytime, it's not necessarily an indication of illness. And so in urban areas, raccoons can not only get a safe place to hide and sleep and shelter and all of that, but they can get lots of food. So where you have humans, you have food. And raccoons are pretty cagey about getting into garbage cans, getting, leftovers, things that are thrown away, taking advantage of pet food, vegetable gardens, fruit trees, all of these things. They're omnivores, and so they can take advantage of that. And they will also actually take advantage of water, so bird baths or ponds or swimming pools, things like that. And a lot of people may have seen raccoons doing what seems to be that they're washing their food. And so it's not that they're fastidiously clean and they just want to get their food clean. They actually have lots and lots of nerve endings on their palms. And it is a really heightened sense for them. And so they're getting a lot of information through their hands. So if you watch raccoons, they're constantly using their hands, they're touching their hands together, they're touching things. They have very agile hands. And so what they're doing when they get their food wet is they're actually getting more sensory information. And so when the food is wet, they are picking up more clues, basically. It's just that much more tactile information that they're getting. So one problem with raccoons being in neighborhoods is that raccoons tend to have these communal latrines. And so it's where they are defecating. A lot of different individuals will defecate in the same place. And so one, it can be messy, it can be inconvenient, but there's actually something else to keep in mind, that raccoons have something called raccoon roundworm. And so this is an intestinal parasite, and the adults of the roundworms breed within the system of the raccoons. They lay their eggs, and then the eggs come out in the raccoon feces. And so that might seem gross and all of that, but there's actually something to be aware of. So the eggs are minute. There can be lots and lots of them in the feces. And the problem is that the eggs can remain viable for years, actually. They can withstand heat and, like sunlight, hot days, and rain and all of that stuff. And so what can happen is, especially if little kids are around or something like that, if they happen to get near this stuff and then put their hands in their mouths, those eggs can be transferred to a human, potentially. It's very rare that it happens, but it's good to keep in mind. And so what happens is, if that egg gets into a host that isn't its normal host, like a raccoon, instead of just turning into the adult form in the intestines, it actually goes into the bloodstream. It gets out of the intestines, goes into the bloodstream, and then it can get into like the nervous system and up into the eyes and all sorts of bad, scary stuff. So it can be quite dangerous. So you just want to be careful. Like I said, it's very, very uncommon for humans to become infected. But if you find a raccoon latrine on your property, just be really careful about cleaning it up. So use gloves. Put it in a garbage bag, and then, throw everything away, wash your hands thoroughly afterward. And one thing that seems to be effective to cleanse the area is just boiling water. The really extreme heat will actually kill the eggs. I said heat, but I meant like a sunny day won't kill them. But extreme heat, like boiling water, will kill them. Things like bleach and chemicals don't work. So just stick to boiling water. So, all right, that's your tip for cleaning up raccoon latrines. So speaking of parasites, Virginia opossums actually may be beneficial to humans when it comes to parasites. There have been some laboratory studies that show that opossums are fastidious cleaners, so they groom themselves really frequently, and that they can end up with a lot of ticks on them. And when they groom ticks off, they eat them. And so if wild opossums are behaving in a similar way as the opossums that were observed in captivity, it could potentially mean that opossums are basically removing potentially Lyme disease carrying ticks from the environment, right? They're ingesting a bunch of ticks just in the course of grooming themselves. So Virginia opossums are really interesting animals in a lot of different ways. I just think they're super cool. So first off, they are the only marsupial in North America north of Mexico. So they're actually, we think of marsupials being in Australia, and about 70% of them are, but there are also marsupials in Central and South America. There are actually several species. But the Virginia opossum is the only one in our neck of the woods. And some people call them possums. Possums are actually a different type of animal. They're a marsupial, but they're found in Australia, and they resemble our opossum. And supposedly that's how they got their name, because they resembled the opossum. But anyway, so they're a marsupial, but they're actually more closely related to kangaroos than to opossums. So if you're in the US and you see one, call it an opossum. So they are not native to California. Virginia opossums, as the name suggests, are more of an eastern species. And so they were found along the East Coast and in the South. And they were brought into California, and now they're all throughout California. And one thought is that they may have been brought by early folks in the early 1900s for food, actually, because people used to eat them. And there supposedly used to be recipes for opossums in the early editions of The Joy of Cooking. But possum pie was one of the things that people would use to eat them. But I think now there's something called possum pie that's more of a sweet confectionery, and it doesn't have any meat in it. Okay, so a couple of things that make Virginia opossums really interesting. They are a marsupial, right? So what that means is that the female gives birth to tiny, tiny, tiny young. They're about the size of a bumblebee, really, really small. And she actually licks a pathway on her underside that the babies follow and climb as they're born. They climb up that pathway and into her pouch. And then they are in her pouch for like over 2 months. And so they're nursing inside of there. They eventually, grow fur, their eyes open. When they're first born, their eyes are shut. They don't have any fur, so they're crawling up into the pouch, blind and tiny. And so they nurse for a couple months, and then they stay in the protection of the pouch until they're a little bit bigger. And then they end up climbing on her back, and she wanders around and she carries them on her back for quite a while. And they finally disperse when they're about 4 or 5 months old. And in the meantime, she's teaching them how to find food and all of their survival skills. So a lot of people have heard that opossums sleep hanging by their tail. I love this cartoon. The one on the left has a little teddy bear that it's cuddling. Anyway, so this is actually a myth. They do have a prehensile tail, and I'll give everyone just a minute to enjoy how adorable this slide is. They have a prehensile tail, but it just doesn't have the structure to support their weight. So very, very young opossums can hang from their tails for a couple minutes, but they can't for a sustained period of time. But it is able to wrap around things, and so they can actually grab things with their tail and carry them, little branches or twigs or things like that. And playing dead is real. Playing possum is real. So this is actually something that happens in response to extreme fear, and it can last for several hours. So if something like a coyote were to come across an opossum, the opossum has very few defenses against a big mammal like that. But if it plays dead, sometimes predators respond to the movement of prey. And so if it's not moving and it's just got its mouth open, its tongue hanging out, its eyes can be open in some cases, that predator very well may lose interest. And so it increases its chances of getting out of that encounter. Opossums aren't very long-lived, surprisingly, for their size and their metabolism. They most only live to be a couple of years old. But they, despite all of these things, have this incredible resistance to a couple of things, one of which is snake bites. So they are virtually immune to rattlesnake venom. And scientists have isolated a specific peptide that neutralizes the venom. And so, of course, people are looking into this to potentially create an anti-venom for humans. And if it's successful, it could be much more cost effective than how snakebite anti-venom is currently produced. Another thing is you might see a possum and, they can move kind of slowly. They kind of waddle around. they could potentially maybe look like they've got rabies, but opossums rarely get rabies. And so they have a much lower body temperature than most North American mammals. And that may have something to do with the fact that they are marsupial and the other North American mammals are placental. But whatever the reason, they've got this lower body temperature. And so it's just not a suitable habitat for rabies to actually thrive in their systems. So they very rarely get rabies. Striped skunks, on the other hand, have a fairly high incidence of rabies, but I will just say in general, since we're talking about wild animals, there's a very low incidence of rabies in Marin County. And so in general, it's not really much of a concern. So here is a mother skunk, and this is springtime. The grass is green, the flowers are blooming, and she's got her little line of young skunks behind her. And so sometimes when she's moving around, they just follow each other in a line like this, and it's super adorable. Oh, I should mention, so this happens in the spring, and the mother raises the young all on her own. She doesn't have any input from the male, and the breeding takes place in the winter time. And so the males will go around and they look for as many females as they can to breed with. And so they'll go from den to den to den, visit a lot of different dens. And if the female isn't receptive, she can end up spraying and to deter the male. And so in the winter time, you get a lot of skunk smell. And part of that is just females basically not really wanting the males to be around their territory. But ultimately, some of them will mate, and then in the spring they'll have babies. And then eventually in the fall, those young will disperse away from the mother and try to find their own territory. Unfortunately, this is when they end up crossing roads. And so in the fall, we see a lot of skunks that are by the side of the road that have been hit by cars. So in the fall, just keep all of this in mind and keep your eye out and drive carefully. But when skunks visit our gardens, sometimes you see evidence like this. Skunks are omnivores, and so they eat, fruit and berries, things like that, but they also eat a lot of grubs and beetles. And so they dig these little pockets, sometimes in lawns or sometimes just in the soil, and they're looking for little yummy snacks to eat. So of course, skunks are known for having this great defense, right? And I just love this photo. This is fabulous. Skunks have these scent glands at one on either side of their anus, and they can spray this chemical defense for several meters, and it's quite potent. And if it gets into the face of a potential predator, it really irritates the mucous membrane. So the lining of the mouth, the inside of the nose, the eye sockets, all of that. So it's very irritating. And if let's say a young animal has, potential predator has come across this, it will always remember it and basically stay away. So there are wildlife cameras near the water sources that have noted that most mammals give skunks a really wide berth. They leave them alone. So on the left here is a red fox, and red foxes aren't native here. And I just want to point out the difference between the red fox and the gray fox that we're going to talk about next. So the red fox has little black boots. It's predominantly red. It has a lot of white on the underside, whereas our native foxes, they don't have those black boots, and they're more gray. So they're gray, but they've got some red on them, but it's kind of just blended in. So the gray fox is our native fox here in the western part of the US. And they are sometimes referred to as the original dog. So it's really interesting. They're a very primitive lineage. So way back when you had an ancestral canine, gray foxes were the kind of the first to diverge. So they diverged really early on, before all of the other canines did. So much before coyotes and wolves and things like that. So they don't interbreed with other species. And they may retain some of the sort of ancestral characteristics that have subsequently been lost in most other canines. So one of those features is their ability to climb. So gray foxes are one of only two species of foxes that regularly climb trees, that have the ability to climb really well and regularly do so. So first off, they have semi-retractable claws. So if anybody is familiar with house cats, you may realize that cats can pull in their claws. They can expand their paws and sort of let out their claws, but normally they are retracted. Whereas in the dog family, their claws are kind of always out. And so when a domestic dog is walking around a lot, the tips of its claws get worn down, whereas a cat's claws are very sharp because they're pulled in, right? So they just don't get that wear and tear on the tips of their claws. So gray foxes have semi-retractable claws and they're very curved. And so this means that they stay really, really sharp. And so they're able to climb trees with them. They also they can rotate their wrists. And that means that they can kind of hug trees with their front limbs and push up with their back limbs. So they're very agile climbers. And then they also have, of all of the canines, they have the shortest legs compared to their bodies. And so that gives them a lower center of gravity, which is also beneficial for climbing trees. So they're really agile climbers. They can get up to like 60 feet in trees. They can jump from branch to branch. And there haven't been that many reports of them actually actively hunting in trees, but I would guess that if they come across something, it would make sense to take advantage of that food source. But one advantage is to get up off the ground and potentially away from other predators like coyotes, like other larger mammals. So this is just an adorable fox taking a nap in a tree. And they are the most omnivorous of all of the canines. So they eat a lot of mammals, a lot of small mammals, and also songbirds. They take a fair amount of songbirds. But they also eat a lot of fruit when it's in season. And so here's this great photo of this gray fox chewing on a fig. So what that means is that they can be attracted to our neighborhoods, right? We have a lot of different foods that they can take advantage of. And similar to the raccoons, we have places where they can den. And in neighborhoods, they are kind of protected from it's sort of like this protective umbrella from things like coyotes. And so they can get under a house or under a shed, have a den. They can also have access to fruits and vegetables, things like that in our neighborhoods. And gray foxes they are monogamous. They have these really strong family units. So the males help raise the young and they form lifelong pairs. They very rarely separate once they've bonded and mated with another. And then they raise their pups and their pups stay with them until the end of the year and then eventually disperse. But a lot of times you can get foxes with their pups in your yards. I had a family one year and it was adorable to watch the little babies. And I should say that they're not much bigger than a house cat. And so they don't really, just for anybody who's curious, they don't really pose a threat to house cats. In fact, I know a lot of examples where foxes and cats play together. What's going on? There we go. So another canine that is a neighborhood visitor are coyotes. And so sometimes it can, people, feel a little bit frightened about having coyotes in neighborhoods, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But I think it's helpful to kind of understand what's going on in the life of coyotes to understand what their behavior is. So in the wintertime, breeding adults pair up and then they establish their den site. And then in the spring, pups are born and they're in the den. In the summertime, the pups end up coming out of the den and start to follow the adults around. And I will say that within the first couple of months, the parents might move the young from den to den. So they don't necessarily stay. In fact, a lot of times they don't stay in the den that they were originally born in. So the adults will move them around a bit. And that's to protect them. It's just instinctual in areas where they overlap with things like wolves or bears or things like that. It's good to kind of keep the young moved around. But anyway, so during the breeding season, the adults can be out and they are hunting around the clock. So a lot of times you see them during the day because they've got these young pups that they're having to feed. And so you can get more sightings of them. Then eventually in the fall, some of the young will disperse. Some will actually stay with their parents, but some will disperse. And when they're dispersing, they're trying to set up their own territories. And then the adults are sort of reestablishing their territory. So you get a lot of vocalizations. You get adults that are kind of saying, hey, we're already here. And you get young that are looking to create their own territory. So lots and lots of vocalizations happen. So coyotes vocalize for different for different reasons. And it can be to define a territory. It can be to communicate across a landscape. So you might have a pair that's communicating with each other, but it's this very important part of their social structure. And they are sort of like ventriloquists. They have the ability to make all of these different noises. And one coyote can sound like more than one coyote, and two coyotes can sound like a bunch of coyotes. So, you know, sometimes people have this perception that they hear coyotes howling and it's like a rabid pack of coyotes is howling over their kill. So there are a few mistruths in there. First off, it's not necessarily a pack. It might be just one or two individuals. And they don't howl over their kill. So in areas where they coexist with wolves or grizzly bears, things like that, if they were to advertise that they have food, those other animals will really quickly learn that they could come and take the food away from the coyotes. So, so it's all about communication. They also, if they have been separated during the course of the evening and they come back together, they greet each other, they get really excited, kind of just like dogs get really excited when you come home. That's the way they behave with each other. And so they'll yip and howl when they greet each other. And so this is just this innate instinctual thing, a very important aspect of their social structure. And it starts really young. This cute little coyote is howling. So they have strong family groups. So you can either have an individual coyote that is basically just spending time on its own. You can have a pair hanging out together. You can have a pair with young from the previous year, and you can have a pair with young from the previous year plus the young from the current year. So you can have isolated individuals or you can have packs, and those packs are family units. And, you know, they work together to protect the young. And to feed them. And domestic dogs and wolves and coyotes are all really closely, evolutionarily speaking, they're very closely related and they can interbreed. But domestic dogs are derived from an ancient wolf that's now extinct. Modern wolves are their closest relatives. And so some dogs look a lot like a wolf or coyote, like these, and some not so much, right? But coyotes perceive domestic dogs as a potential threat. Like if a domestic dog comes into their territory, they're sort of seen as a wolf coming into their territory. And wolves will actually, where wolves and coyotes overlap, wolves will actively seek out and kill coyotes, especially their young. And so this is a significant threat, right? And so they respond accordingly. And so sometimes during the breeding season, if you have domestic dogs that are coming near to a den, an active coyote den, the coyotes respond by wanting to seem really scary. So their hackles get raised, they growl, they snarl, they get really assertive, they stand their ground, and it's all about protecting their young. And so they perceive dogs as a threat, a potential threat, and they respond accordingly. And so this is a natural part of their behavior. And they don't want to actually come into physical contact. They try to avoid that. That's why they try to look big and scary, to avoid that, because if they were to be bitten, it could become infected. They could end up dying. So it's risky to have physical contact. But obviously, you don't necessarily want this happening in neighborhoods, right? So if you have coyotes that are spending time in your neighborhoods, you can do what's called hazing. And so this is this great public service announcement from Madison, Wisconsin. So what you want to do is you want to act big and loud, and it's great if you get your neighbors involved. So if you have coyotes that are spending a lot of time in your neighborhood, you can try to discourage them, try to show them that neighborhoods it's not a welcome place. So be big and loud, wave your hands, yell, bang pots together, take a can and fill it with marbles or pebbles or something and shake it, make a lot of noise. You can even throw objects near them, don't hit the coyotes, but to just like try to scare them away, tennis balls or sticks or rocks, just as I said, don't hit them. You can spray a hose at them. And so you just want to encourage them to move on. But keep in mind that the reason why they're coming into neighborhoods is to look for food. So where you have humans, you have rodents. And so we have rats and we have mice around our human habitations. And coyotes eat a lot of small rodents. And so they will definitely take advantage of that. And they also are omnivores. They eat a lot of fruit. And so if you have fruit trees, you can make sure that you don't have fallen fruit on the ground, pick it up, because otherwise that can be an attractant. And also garbage. So a lot of times, if there's food left out, coyotes will take advantage of that, and that can be an attractant as well. So one of the best ways to keep coyotes out of your neighborhoods is to not have things that are attractive to them. So on that note, in general, I kind of just want to take a second and talk about feeding wildlife. Don't do it. There are a lot of reasons not to, and we'll quickly go through them. But a lot of people really are fond of wildlife, and they think that they're doing something good by feeding them, but actually it ends up being a bad thing. And so a lot of wildlife managers have this phrase, a fed animal is a dead animal, in reference to wild animals. And so one thing is, human food and even pet food has much lower nutritional value than what they can find if they're foraging in the wild on their own. So it's just not good for them nutritionally. And they can end up getting a lot of fillers, like, carbohydrates and things like that fill them up. So then they're not as hungry. They don't actively hunt as much. And so they can end up becoming weakened and sick if they aren't getting the proper nutrients. Another thing is, if animals get accustomed to begging from humans, hand feeding them, giving them food, then they can congregate in parks and in parking lots and places like that, which brings them closer to roadways, closer to cars, and they can end up getting hit by cars. And then also, if you leave food out to attract wildlife, you can get congregations of wildlife, and that can really quickly spread diseases. So where you have animals congregating, like things with deer, there's this really bad disease called, it's a hemorrhagic disease. It's a adenovirus hemorrhagic disease, and it's quite often fatal. And it's passed through close contact. So if animals are sharing water, or if they're getting close enough to exchange bodily fluids just from their noses or their mouths or anything. And so it's really bad news. So if you, even if you think that leaving out water would be a good thing, it actually can do more harm than good. And then also, unfortunately, if animals become accustomed to humans, they can look to humans for food and start relying on humans. And then when they don't get fed, they can become aggressive, and that never ends well. So you're doing animals a disservice if it gets to the point where they are so accustomed to humans giving them food that they will end up biting humans or something like that. And in those cases, they tend to be often they have to be captured and euthanized. So if you love animals, do not feed them. Okay, back to the good stuff. So bobcats are another species that will hang around our yards, and similar to coyotes, they'll take advantage of rodents. And then also, a nice safe place to den can be under decks, under houses, things like that. So sometimes we get bobcats around. And the males don't have anything to do with raising the young. It's just the females, and they will stay with their mom for about a year or so. And so she cleans them and licks them and protects them, like this little one. And so she teaches them their survival skills, and then ultimately they disperse to find their own territories. So a couple things to note on bobcats. They've got these false eyes on the back of their ears. You can see these white spots. So that's a good characteristic. They have a fairly short tail, and so that's why they're called a bobcat. They have a bobtail, and then usually they have spotting or stripes on them, but that's not always super obvious. And then also they're really variable in size. A female can be just not much bigger than a house cat. Like a small female can weigh 14 pounds or so, whereas a big male can weigh about 40 pounds. And so a lot of people mistake bobcats for mountain lions. Mountain lions are much, much, much bigger. They have a really long tail, kind of a different structure. And so a mountain lion is kind of long and lean, and a bobcat is more of a squarish shape. One thing to keep in mind is that bobcat and mountain lions don't show claw marks. But if you look at the domestic dog, it looks a lot like a mountain lion, right? But it shows claw marks, so keep that in mind. And then the coyote typically is more of an oval rather than a round shape compared to a dog print. So just to kind of keep these prints in mind. Okay, so we're going to do something fun. Kind of squint your eyes, and I'm going to quickly go through these and see if you can spot the mountain lion. Okay, so basically none of these were a mountain lion. But this one, it's got this nice long tail, right? So the first had a shorter tail. They were all bobcats. But you could see how if you just get a quick glance at a cat, and it's hard to judge size if the cat's at a distance, it could be easy to mistake a mountain lion for a bobcat. But mountain lions are super shy. Okay, but anyway, so this cat was reported as a mountain lion in a neighborhood, and it turns out it's a domestic cat, but it looks kind of like a mountain lion. So that one's a fun one. But mountain lions are shy. They tend to be more active at night. They tend to avoid people. Their main prey items are deer, though. And so especially during drought and summertime, when deer are coming down into neighborhoods for more food, mountain lions can show up as well. But they really aren't a threat to humans. For a long time, there was only one recorded mountain lion. It had a problem with one of its eyes, so it only had eye shine in one eye. So this mountain lion was recorded several times, and it was thought maybe this is the only one in the county. And then another one popped up, and this one obviously has eye shine in both eyes. So it was like, okay, we have at least two. But now that people have security cameras all over their houses, we're getting all of these reports of mountain lions. So a lot of mountain lion sightings. And the fabulous news is they have been living amongst us without any problems for a long time. They're active at night, and they tend to, like I said, stay away from people. One species that is very obvious during the day that we definitely see a lot are squirrels. So we have Western gray squirrel, which is our native squirrel, and this is a big squirrel compared to the other species. It has a big bushy tail, and it's gray on the back and white on the underside. So this is our native species. And then Eastern grays are becoming more abundant in the county. And they've got a little bit of red mixed in. They've got a white underbelly, but they've got some red on their face, red on their flanks, and their tail is much skinnier. And then fox squirrels are also non-native. And so they're more of this kind of reddish color. Their underside is kind of a yellowy. They've got a fairly skinny tail as well. So the two non-native squirrels are becoming more abundant, and they're actually out-competing, seemingly, our native squirrel. And it may be because the Western gray, our native squirrel, only has one brood of young per year, whereas the non-natives typically have two. So just through sheer number, they're becoming more numerous and outcompeting our native squirrels. I will note that a lot of nest predation gets blamed on crows, but squirrels are one of the top nest predators, and they're up in trees. They get in the nests and they eat eggs, and they also eat baby birds. So just keep that in mind. And then sometimes during the breeding season, you see these crazy chases with numerous squirrels chasing each other. So what's going on is this is actually males sort of vying for dominance. So you have multiple males that are running around, and a lot of times they're chasing a female. And so the one that ends up being the most dominant will end up mating with the female. And there's accounts of once that happens, the male and the female mate, but the other males still keep chasing each other around. So it's part of their sort of establishing a hierarchy among the males. And then the females raise the young by themselves. And so a lot of times it's in a cavity of a tree, and then sometimes she'll move them. And sometimes they'll use what's called a dray. It's a big nest. It's hard. It can be hard to differentiate between a raptor nest and a squirrel nest. Some of these are open and some are closed. They're used for different purposes and at different times of the year. If it's good weather, bad weather, place to sleep during the day, or place to give birth, will depend on whether it's covered or not. We also have black squirrels. So these are becoming more common in Marin. And it's thought that before Europeans came and colonized the US, that these were much more predominant. There were a lot more of them, but with deforestation, like they were better protected being that dark colored and deeper forest, but with deforestation, that the gray morph actually was better for survival. So anyway, we have black squirrels here, and they are just a colored mutation, basically, of either the eastern gray or the fox squirrel. Both of those can have black. The western gray typically doesn't have a black morph. And then the eastern gray also has blonde morphs. So sometimes you'll see these. And in one batch of young, you could have gray, black, and blonde. So another common neighborhood rodent are pocket gophers. And I just want to really quickly note the difference between gophers and moles. So gophers are herbivores, so they eat plants, they eat roots of plants, things like that, and they look like this. And their holes a lot of times have a, pushed out dirt. A lot of times it's kind of in a fan, and a lot of times there's a hole in the center. So this is evidence of a gopher. Whereas broad-footed moles aren't rodents. They're actually insecticides. They're not eating your plants. They're actually eating grubs and things that will eat the roots of your plant, and beetles and those grubs will grow up to become beetles that can eat your plants. So moles are actually a good thing to have in your garden. They're eating potential pests, and they're also helping to aerate the soil. So when they move around, they actually, a lot of times you see these sort of berms like this. And so they're right at the surface, and they're kind of just swimming through the soil looking for bugs. But in the process, they're aerating the soil. They're bringing oxygen into the soil, which can be a good thing. So this is kind of what's going on. You can have a molehill, and a lot of times it's plugged, it doesn't have a hole. And then the feeding runways are close to the surface, whereas their permanent tunnels are down lower. And last but not least, we have wild turkeys. So wild turkeys are not native to this area, and they can actually cause a lot of soil disturbance. We were just talking about moles are a good thing. The turkeys actually will eat a lot of invertebrates that live in the soil, but they'll leave the predators like spiders, things like that. So things can get a little bit out of balance. And studies have just shown that they do a great deal of damage when they've looked at exclusion areas and then areas where the turkeys can forage. They really take a toll on just the sort of native balance in our soils and all of that. They also eat a lot of acorns, which a lot of our native animals rely on acorns, and an individual turkey can eat a pound of food per meal. So they're taking quite a lot. So in the spring, you have the males that are just strutting around showing off to the females. A lot of times the females kind of just seem to ignore them, but the males are sort of, trying to impress the females and try to be bigger and bolder than the other males. And eventually all of the females will end up mating. And then they disperse and they go off on their own to lay their eggs, and they will have their babies in seclusion until they get a little bit older. And then so here's another male that's strutting around. And then in the summertime, they will end up coming together with other females with lots of babies. And so toward the end of the summer, you can get these huge flocks of females, and they're young. And then eventually in the winter time, as those young grow up and become adults, then they separate into flocks of all males and all females. So during the winter time, you have big flocks of females and then flocks of males. And so when you come full circle back to spring, then those males just go try to find the flocks of females so that they can court them, right? So wild turkeys aren't native to this area. They are an introduced species, and they're purposely introduced from the California Department of Fish and Game, game being the operative word there. So they were brought in for hunting, and there were several attempts in like the 1870s and again in the early 1900s to introduce them. But those were farm-raised turkeys, and they just didn't survive in the wild. And so finally in the 1970s, again, the California Department of Fish and Game brought in wild turkeys from Rio Grande in Texas. And those actually were able to survive, and now they have populated pretty much the entire state. So our turkeys here are Rio Grande turkeys. And there used to be, which is now extinct, a California turkey, but it died out about 10,000 years ago, and it was different. It was smaller, different structure from the wild turkeys. So anyway, they're fun to watch, but they can actually be ecological stressors and aren't actually really great to have around. But anyway, there you go. All right. So one interesting thing is turkeys will actually sometimes forage with deer and squirrel. And the thought is that it helps them to be more aware of predators. So deer have a great sense of smell. Turkeys have superior eyesight. And then also squirrels will get in the mix too, and they can actually see predators from up above. And so they have a good vision from above and can sound an alarm. So it's just interesting that these three species can be foraging together. And one thought that I had is that they all eat acorns. Deer eat a lot of acorns in the fall. Turkeys eat a lot of acorns, and of course squirrels do. So maybe they're all foraging under oaks and they just sort of take advantage of the others' heightened senses to sort of do it cooperatively. But there is some evidence that they'll actually play. And so this shot is from this great video you can find online on YouTube. It's a BBC video of a fawn playing with turkeys. And then a little bit later in the video, it shows a squirrel playing with turkeys, and it's pretty fun. So if you're just, wanting a little bit more wildlife stuff to watch after this, you can tune into that. And with that, I will wrap it up. So I think if there are any questions, Shireen will field those, and I'll be happy to answer.
Well, hi, thank you. That was really informative, and I am just going to start with questions. The first is, are the raccoon feces harmful for pets and other animals?
That's a good question. I would say that you probably, sometimes dogs will eat feces of other animals and they aren't the intended host. I don't know of any actual instances of it being dangerous, but if it was me, I would err on the side of caution. So yeah, and that might be something that if you looked up online or even Marin Humane Society or even Wild Care might have more information on.
Okay, thank you. Someone asked, we have a saltwater pool. Is that an option for wild animals to get drinking water?
Most wild animals don't drink salt water because they just can't really process it well unless they've evolved to process it. So my guess would be no if the salinity is fairly high.
Okay. How can you tell the difference between a gray fox and a bobcat's call?
So I'm not familiar with bobcat's call, so I can't say comparatively. But gray foxes kind of do a guttural, red foxes have a very distinct, it's like a, but gray foxes are more of a kind of guttural bark, and they're not as vocal as red foxes. They can do like a little bit of yipping, but when I've heard them, yeah, it sounds more kind of like this deep-throated, like kind of little barks.
Okay. Here's a good question. Is it okay to have a freshwater bird bath outdoors? The hummingbirds visit it every day.
Yeah, so that's interesting. And that's a good point that when I talked about feeding wildlife, that doesn't include birds. So usually bird food is of equal nutritional value to what they're finding in the wild. So whether it's a seed feeder or a hummingbird feeder is like mimicking nectar. And usually birds are supplementing their natural food sources with feeders. And it's not like they're coming in direct contact with humans. And so they don't necessarily, aren't in danger of becoming too accustomed to humans. So I'll just say that. And I would say that bird baths are fine. You do want to make sure that you clean it. And so again, it can be a way of diseases getting spread. So you just want to make sure, and the same with bird feeders too. You want to keep these things really, really clean because this is where animals are congregating. And so periodically washing either the feeders or the bird bath, like every few days with a solution of bleach. You want to do like one part bleach to 10 parts water. Give it a scrub, wash it out, let it dry, and then fill it up with water again. But bird baths can be a delightful way to observe birds. Yeah, just make sure you keep it clean.
Thank you. Um, so someone says, I've seen huge nests of sticks at the beginning of Oakwood Fire Trail and was told they are wood rat nests, but now I'm wondering if they are squirrels. Do you know? These are sticks up in the trees, not on the ground.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so for the most part here in Marin, wood rats are build nests on the ground. They can be quite big. They're like a dome, and they look just like a big pile of sticks. Sometimes they build stick nests up in trees. The only place that I've seen that in Marin County is on the Bob Stewart Trail near Bolinas. And my thought is that the ground is pretty damp there. It's kind of soggy, so that may be why. I know that down in Santa Cruz County, wood rats more frequently build nests up in trees. In Marin County, my experience is that for the most part, they are on the ground. Squirrel nests, the tree squirrels tend to build their stick nests pretty high up in trees. So I would say it would depend on the size and where it is in the tree. But if it's high up in a tree, I would say that it's a tree squirrel.
Thank you. And we've got a lot of thank yous, and it is 11. So I think we're going to have to call it at that point. If you have more questions, you can email Shannon or myself. And I just want to echo many of the thank yous that are coming in. It was a wonderful talk. Have a great day. And this recording will be up in a couple weeks on our YouTube website. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks, Shireen. Thanks for tuning in,
Thank
everyone.
you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.